We should stop using the concepts of race and caste, stop dividing the human community up by genealogical descent. The idea is to lessen the chances that the question, who are his or her ancestors, will be asked. So people urge that words like noble blood, mixed blood, outcast, intermarriage, untouchable, and the like simply be dropped from the language. This line of thinking is sometimes countered by saying, but there really are inherited differences. Ancestry does matter. The rejoinder is, well, there are inheritable physical characteristics, but they in themselves don't correlate with any characteristics that could provide a good reason for breaking up a planned marriage or voting for or against a candidate. We may need the notion of genetic transmission for medical purposes, but not for any other purposes, so instead of talking about different races, we can just talk about different genes. In the case of race, as in that of noble blood, the question, is there such a thing, and the question, should we talk about such a thing, seem pretty well interchangeable. That's why we tend to classify discussion of whether we should stop talking about different races as political, rather than scientific or philosophical. But there are other cases in which it seems odd to identify questions about what exists with questions about what it's desirable to discuss. Thus, the question of whether to talk about neutrons seems a strictly scientific question. So people who regret that physicists ever investigated radioactivity or speculated about the possibility of splitting the atom are accused of confusing science with politics. It seems natural to us to separate the political question of whether it was a good thing for humanity that scientists began to think about the possibility of atomic fission from scientific questions about the existence and properties of certain elementary particles. The contrast between the case of races and that of neutrons raises the question I want to discuss. How do we tell when, if ever, an issue about what exists should be discussed without reference to our socio-political goals? How should we split up culture into areas to which politics is relevant and cultural politics is relevant and areas which should be kept free of it? When is it appropriate to say we'd better talk about it because it exists, and when is that remark not to the point? These questions are important for debates about what roles religion should play in contemporary society. Many people think we should just stop talking about God. They think this for much the same reasons they believe talk of race and caste to be a bad thing. People like Lucretius and Marx advance all the usual reasons why God talk has been a social misfortune. To say that talk about God should be dropped because it impedes the search for human happiness is to take a pragmatic attitude toward religion that many believers find offensive and that some theologians think beside the point. The point, they would insist, is that God exists, or perhaps that human beings really do have immortal souls. Granted that the existence of God or of an immortal soul is controversial, that controversy should be explicitly about what exists, not about whether religious belief conduces to human happiness. First things first, ontology precedes cultural politics. I want to argue that cultural politics should replace ontology, and also that the question, should it, is itself a question of cultural politics. Before turning to the defense of these theses, I want to underline the importance of these issues for philosophers who, like myself, are sympathetic to William James's pragmatism. James agreed with John Stuart Mill that the right thing to do, and a fortiori the right belief to acquire, is always the one that will do most for human happiness. So he advocated a utilitarian ethics of belief. James often comes close to saying that all questions, including questions about what exists, boil down to questions about what will help create a better world. James's willingness to say this sort of thing has made him subject to accusations of intellectual perversity. For his view seems to suggest that when notions like race mixing or atomic fission are brought into the conversation, it's always opposite to exclaim, let's not talk about that sort of thing. It's too dangerous. Let's not go there. James seems to countenance doing what Peirce forbade, blocking the road of inquiry, refusing to find out what the world is really like because doing so might have harmful effects on human beings. To give a concrete example, many people have argued that psychologists shouldn't try to find out whether inheritable physical features are correlated with intelligence, simply because of the social harm that a positive answer to the question might produce. And James's view of truth seems to suggest that these people are making a good point. People who are suspicious of pragmatism, on the other hand, argue that preventing scientists from doing experiments to find out whether intelligence is genetically transmissible, or to find out whether a neutron bomb is feasible, is to sin against truth. On their view, we should separate practical questions about whether eugenics or racial discrimination should be practiced from the straightforwardly empirical question about whether Europeans are, on average, stupider than Asiatics, just as we divide the question of whether we can build a neutron bomb from the question of whether we should. James was criticized not only for blocking the road of inquiry and thus for being too restrictive, but also for being too permissive. That criticism was most frequently directed at his essay, The Will to Believe, an essay which he correctly said should have been entitled The Right to Believe. There he argued that one had a right to believe in the existence of God if that belief contributed to one's happiness for no reason other than that very contribution. I think the best way for those of us who find James's pragmatism sympathetic to restate his position is to say that questions about what's too permissive and what's too restrictive are themselves questions of cultural politics. For example, the question of whether religious believers should, in the manner of W.K. Clifford, be asked for evidence for the truth of their belief and condemned as uneducated or irrational if they are unable to produce such evidence, is a question about what sort of role we want religion to play in our society. It's on all fours with the question raised by the Inquisition: should scientists be allowed cavalierly to disregard Scripture when they formulate hypotheses about the motions of heavenly bodies? The question of whether we should, for the sake of preserving ancient traditions, allow parents to perpetuate a caste system by dictating choices of marriage partners to their children is the same sort of question. Such questions arise whenever new social practices are beginning to compete with old ones, when, for example, the new science of 17th century Europe began to compete with the Christian churches for control of higher education, or when a traditional African culture is exposed to European ways. The question of whether scientists should be allowed to find out whether the atom can be split, or should be allowed to investigate the correlation of intelligence with skin color, is not a question that can be answered simply by "do not block the road of inquiry" or "seek the truth though the heavens fall." Neither can the question of whether France and Germany are right to criminalize the denial that the Holocaust occurred and Britain and America right not to criminalize it. There's much to be said on both sides. The argument for letting scientists investigate whatever they please is that the more ability to predict we can get, the better off we'll be in the long run. The argument for blocking them off from certain topics is that the short-run dangers are so great as to outweigh the chances of long-term benefit. There are no grand philosophical principles that could help us solve these problems of risk management. To say that James is basically right in his approach to truth and reality is to say that arguments about relative dangers and benefits are the only arguments that matter. That's why we should be talking about it because it's real is as pointless as we should believe it because it's true. Attributions of reality or truth are, on the view I share with James, compliments we pay to entities or beliefs that have won their spurs, paid their way, proved themselves useful, and therefore been incorporated into accepted social practices. When these practices are being contested, it is of no use to say that reality or truth is on the side of one of the contestants. Such claims will always be mere table thumping, not serious contributions to cultural politics. Another way to put James's point is to say that truth and reality exist for the sake of social practices rather than vice versa. Like the Sabbath, they are social constructs made for man. This is a dark saying, but I think it can be defended by appealing to the work of a contemporary neo-Hegelian, Robert Brandom, whose writings provide the best weapons for defending my version of James's pragmatism. Brandom is not a utilitarian, and his work follows out the line of thought that leads from Kant to Hegel rather than the one that leads from Mill to James, But his construal of assertions as the assumption of responsibilities to other members of society rather than to the world or the truth brings him into alignment with James. The germ of Brandam's later work can be found in an early article on Heidegger. Brandam, incidentally, is the author of a big, highly technical book called Making It Explicit, a condensed, less technical version of the same book called Articulating Reasons. And this fall he will publish a book called Tales of the Mighty Dead, which is essays on the history of philosophy, and that book includes his essays on Heidegger. The germ of Brandam's later work can be found in an early article on Heidegger, where he treats Heidegger as putting forward a doctrine called the ontological priority of the social. This doctrine is perhaps not happily thought of as ontological, but Brandam is using it as a way of expiating the consequences of Heidegger's quasi-pragmatist attempt in Sein und Zeit to make the Zuhanden prior to the Vorhanden, to make roughly know-how prior to knowing that. The priority in question consists in the fact that, I quote Brandam, all matters of authority or privilege, in particular epistemic authority, are matters of social practice and not objective matters of fact. That's the doctrine of the priority of the social. There's no authority that is not granted by social practice. It's the only place authority can come from. Brandam enlarges on this claim by remarking that society divides culture up into three areas. In the first of these, the individual's authority is supreme, as when she makes sincere first-person reports of her feelings or thoughts. In the second, the non-human world is supreme, as when the litmus paper or the DNA analysis apparatus or the behavior of the chickens when you're taking auguries is allowed to determine whether the accused will be freed or punished, or whether a given scientific theory will be accepted or rejected. But there's a third area in which society doesn't delegate, either to the individual or to the non-human world, but retains the right to decide for itself, and that's the arena of cultural politics. Brandam analogizes this situation to the constitutional arrangements of the U.S., according to which, as he says, quote, the judiciary is given the authority and responsibility to interpret the proper region of authority and responsibility of each branch, itself included. The question at issue between James and his opponents boiled down to this. Is there an authority beyond that of society that society should acknowledge, an authority such as God or truth or reality? Brandam's account of assertions as assumptions of social responsibility leaves no room for such an authority, and thereby he sides with James. Both philosophers appeal to Occam's razor. The authority traditionally attributed to the non-human can be explained sociologically, and such a sociological account has no need to invoke the rather mysterious beings that theological or philosophical treatments of authority require. Entities such as the divine will, the intrinsic nature of reality, the immediately given character of experience, and so on. Suppose one accepts the thesis of the ontological primacy of the social. Then one will think that the question of the existence of God is a question of the advantages and disadvantages of using God talk over against alternative ways of talking. As with race, so with God. Instead of talking about races, we can, for many purposes, talk about genes. Instead of talking about God the Creator, we can, as physicists do, talk about the Big Bang. For other purposes, such as providing foundations of morality, we can talk, as Habermas does, about consensus under ideal communicative conditions, rather than about the divine will. When discussing the future of humanity, we can talk, as Marx did, about a secularist social utopia instead of about the Last Judgment, and so on. Suppose, however, that one doesn't accept the doctrine of the priority of the social precisely because one is a religious believer and holds that God has authority over human society as well as over everything else. From Brandam's point of view, this is like holding that human society is subject to the authority of reality or experience or truth. All attempts to name an authority which is superior to that of society are disguised moves in the game of cultural politics because that's the only game in town. But notice that in saying that it's the only game in town, Brandam is not claiming to have made an empirical discovery, nor is he claiming something like a conceptual necessity, he is himself articulating a cultural political stance by pointing to the social advantages of his account of authority. That is, he is doing what Hegel called, following Hegel's definition of philosophy, an attempt to hold one's time in thought. That is to say, this is how we have talked so far. Let us now try talking this way and see if the consequences are better. That is not a claim to necessary truth, nor is it a claim to have empirical evidence. It is a cultural political proposal. Brandom's view can be made more plausible by considering what people actually have in mind when they say that God has authority over human society. They don't say that unless they think they know what God wants human beings to do, unless they can cite sacred scriptures or the words of a guru or the teachings of an ecclesiastical tradition or something of the sort in support of their own position. But from the point of view of both atheists and people whose scripture or guru or tradition is different, what's purportedly said in the name of God is actually said in the name of some interest group, some sect or church, for example. Two competing religious groups will typically say that the other willfully and blasphemously refuses to submit to God's authority. The battles between two such groups are analogous to arguments between opposing counsel presenting appellate briefs in court. Both lawyers will claim to have what they call the authority of the law on their side. Alternatively, it can be analogized to the battle between two scientific theories, both of which claim to be true to the nature of reality. Brandom's point is that the appeal to God, like the appeal to the law, is always superfluous, since as long as there is disagreement about what the purported authority says, the idea of authority remains out of place. Only when the community decides to adopt one faith rather than another, or the court decides in favor of one side rather than another, or the scientific community in favor of one theory rather than another, does the notion of authority have a role. The so-called authority of anything other than the community, or some person or thing or expert culture authorized by the community to make decisions in its name, can only be mere table thumping. The counterintuitive character of Brandom's claim is due in part to the unfortunate lingering popularity of empiricism. Empiricists tell us that we can break out from under the authority of the local community by making unmediated contact with reality. This view encouraged, for example, the idea that Europe finally got in touch with reality when scientists like Galileo had the courage to believe the evidence of their senses rather than bowing to the authority of Aristotle and the Church. Brandom agrees with his teacher, Wilfrid Sellars, that the idea of getting in direct touch with reality through the senses is a confusion between relations of justification, which hold between propositions, and causal relations, which hold between events. We should not treat the causal ability of certain events to produce non-inferential beliefs in suitably programmed organisms as a justification for the organism holding that belief. Brandom agrees with Sellars that all awareness is a linguistic affair. On this view, creatures not programmed to use language, such as dogs and human infants, react to stimuli, but they're not aware of anything. They're no more aware of the characteristics of things than thermostats are aware of heat and cold. There can be no such thing as bypassing the linguistic practices of the community by using one's senses to find out how things really are, for two reasons. First, all non-inferential perceptual reports, such as this is red, this is disgusting, this is holy, are made in the language of one or another community, a language adapted to that community's needs. Second, the community grants authority to such reports, not because it believes in a special relation between reality and human sense organs, but because it has empirical evidence that such reports are reliable in the sense that they will be confirmed by the application of further independent criteria. This means that when somebody reports experiencing an object about which the community has no reason to think her a reliable reporter, her appeal to experience always falls flat. If I say that round squares are, contrary to popular opinion, possible, because I've in fact recently encountered some, nobody takes me seriously. The same goes if I come out of the forest claiming to have spotted a unicorn. If I say that I've experienced God, this may or may not be taken seriously, depending on what uses of the term God are current in my community. If I explain to a Christian audience that personal observation has shown me that God is, contrary to popular opinion, female, the audience may just laugh. If I say that I've seen the risen Christ in the disk of the sun on Easter morning, it's possible that I'll be viewed with respect and envy. In short, God reports have to live up to previous expectations, just as do reports of physical objects. They can't all by themselves be used to repudiate those expectations. They're useful for this purpose only when they form part of a full-fledged, concerted cultural political initiative. This is what happens when a new religion or church replaces an old one. It was not the disciples' reports of an empty tomb all by themselves that made Europe believe that God was incarnate in Christ, but in the context of St. Paul's overall public relations strategy, these reports had their effect. Analogously, it was not Galileo's report of spots moving across the face of the planet Jupiter, possibly caused by the transits of moons, that overthrew the authority of the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology, but in the context of the initiative being mounted by Galileo's fellow Copernican cultural politicians, that report had considerable impact. I can sum up what I've been saying about appeals to experience as follows. Experience gives us no way to drive a wedge between the cultural political question of what we should talk about and the question of what really exists. For what counts as an accurate report of experience is a matter of what a community will let you get away with. Empiricism's appeal to experience is as inefficacious as appeals to the Word of God, unless backed up with a predisposition on the part of the community to take such appeals seriously. So experience cannot by itself adjudicate disputes between warring cultural politicians. I can make my point about the irrelevance of religious experience to God's existence a bit more vivid by comparing the God of Orthodox Western monotheism with consciousness as understood by Cartesian dualists. In the unphilosophical sense of the term conscious, the existence of consciousness is indisputable. People in a coma lack consciousness. People are conscious as long as they're walking and talking. But there's a special philosophical sense of the term consciousness in which the very existence of consciousness is highly disputable. In this sense of consciousness, the word refers to something the absence of which is compatible with walking and talking, because it's what zombies lack that the rest of us possess. Zombies behave just like normal people, but they have no inner life. The light bulb in their brains, so to speak, never goes on. They don't feel anything, although they can answer questions about how they feel in the conventional ways which have the place they do in the language game by virtue of, for example, correlations between their utterances of "it hurts" and their having recently touched hot stoves, being pricked by pins, and the like. Talking to a zombie is just like talking to anybody else, since the zombie's lack of an inner life never manifests itself by any outward and visible sign. That is why, unless neurology someday discovers the secret of non-zombiehood, and how is it going to, because it doesn't know which of its subjects are zombies and which aren't, we shall never know whether our nearest and dearest share our feelings or what James calls automatic sweethearts. Philosophers have spent decades arguing about whether this sense of consciousness and this sense of zombie makes sense. The question is, can a descriptive term have a sense if its application is regulated by no public criteria? Wittgenstein thought the answer to that question was no. The negative answer was the upshot of arguments like the following in a famous passage in the Investigations. Wittgenstein writes, "Suppose everyone had a box with something in it. We call it a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here it would be possible for everybody to have something different in their box. One might even imagine such a thing constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. No one can divide through by the thing in the box. It cancels through. It cancels out, whatever it is." End of quote. The analogues of these private beetles are what philosophers who believe in the possibility of zombies call raw feels, or qualia, the immediate, non-linguistic, phenomenal presence to consciousness of what it is like to be in pain, what it is like to see something red, and so on. We all know what it's like to be in pain, these philosophers believe, but despite their perfectly sincere avowals that they do too, zombies don't. It's just you never know which of your interlocutors are zombies. Wittgenstein would say that the word pain has a sense only as long as philosophers do not treat it as the name of something whose presence or absence swings free of all differences in environment and behavior. On his view, the philosophers who believe in qualia and who deploy expressions like what it is like to be in pain are proposing and commending a new, as it were specifically Cartesian, language game. In this game, we use expressions whose only function is to help us disjoin pain from pain behavior. We use them to separate off the outer behavior and its neurological correlates from something that is neither a state of the body nor of the nervous system. Wittgenstein, when he's being properly cautious, thinks that anything has a sense if you give it one by playing an appropriate language game with it, but Wittgenstein, Sellers, various other philosophers see no point in playing the Cartesian qualia game. So they think we're entitled to divide through by the qualia, just as Wittgenstein did with the Beatles, to treat them, as Wittgenstein says, as a wheel that turns though nothing else moves with it and is therefore not part of the mechanism. Philosophers of mind like Daniel Dennett and Sellers agree with Wittgenstein, but they are criticized by philosophers more sympathetic to Descartes, such as nowadays David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel. Chalmers is currently spending huge sums of taxpayers' money in Santa Cruz discussing the nature of qualia and the possibility of finding out more about them. From my point of view, of course, this is straight down the drain. The latter philosophers say that the existence of raw fields, of the experience of what it is like, is incontestable, and so they reject Brandam's and Sellers and Brandam's doctrine that all awareness is a linguistic affair. There is, they say, more awareness than we can put into words. Language can point to things that it cannot describe. To think otherwise, they say, is to be a verificationist, and verificationists display what Thomas Nagel regards as, quote, an undesirable lack of the ambition for transcendence. Nagel writes as follows, only a dogmatic verificationist would deny the possibility of forming objective concepts that reach beyond our current capacity to apply them. That is, we have no idea how to figure out what's a zombie, but we got the concept zombie anyway, and we can hold philosophical institutes to think about it. The aim, continuing with Nagel, the aim of reaching a conception of the world which does not put us in the center in any way requires the formation of such concepts. Here Nagel and I entirely agree. What we disagree about is whether it's desirable to form a conception of the world which does not put human beings in the center. Brandam's doctrine of the ontological priority of the social would, of course, only be adopted by somebody who has little interest in reaching a conception of the world that does not put us in the center. Brandam, Sellers, and Wittgenstein simply lack the ambition of transcendence that Nagel, resembling in this respect the orthodox theologians of Western monotheism, thinks it desirable to have. Those theologians, in their anxiety to make God sufficiently transcendent, separated him from the things of this world by describing him as without parts or passions, non-spatio-temporal, and therefore incomparable to his creatures. They went on to insist that the fact that God's incomparability is nonetheless compatible with his making himself known to us in experience. Nagel and those who wish to preserve the special philosophical Cartesian notion of consciousness, the thing that zombies lack, are trying to give sense to a descriptive term by a series of negations, just as the theologians did. But they, like the theologians, insist that the fact that consciousness is like nothing else in the universe is compatible with our being directly and incorrigibly aware of it. Both those who want to use God in the way that Orthodox theology does and those who want to use consciousness, as Chalmers and Nagel do, claim that their opponents, the people who don't want to play any of these language games, whose cultural political initiatives are aimed at getting rid of qualia on the one hand, God on the other, are denying the obvious. Many Orthodox theologians have claimed that denial of the existence of God simply flies in the face of the common experience of mankind. Nagel thinks that philosophical views such as Dennett's stem from an insufficient, I quote Nagel, Dennett's view stems from an insufficiently robust sense of reality and of its independence of any particular form of human understanding, end quote. Many religious believers think that it requires considerable perversity to even imagine being an atheist. And Nagel, I think, thinks that it requires similar perversity to weaken one's sense of reality to the point where one could take seriously the doctrine of the ontological priority of the social. The moral I want to draw from the analogy between God and consciousness is that the existence of either is not a matter which appeals to experience could ever resolve, any more than one can appeal to experience to determine whether or not marriage across caste or racial lines is, or is not, intrinsically disgusting. Cultural politics can create a society that will find the latter repulsive, and cultural politics of a different sort can create one that finds such marriages entirely unobjectionable. There's no way to show that belief in God or in qualia is more or less natural than disbelief, any more than there is a way to figure out whether a sense of caste membership or race membership is more or less natural than utter indifference to human bloodlines. What one side of the argument calls natural, the other is likely to call primitive or perhaps contrived. Similarly, cultural politics of the sort conducted in Europe since the Enlightenment can alternately diminish or increase the obviousness of God's existence, as well as the frequency of reports to have experienced his presence. Cultural politics of the sort conducted within analytic departments of philosophy can diminish or increase the numbers of philosophy students who find the existence of qualia obvious and find it equally obvious that some humanoids might be zombies. There are Dennett-leaning departments where you're laughed at if you talk about qualia, and Chalmers-leaning departments where you're laughed at if you don't talk about qualia. The disagreement between these two kinds of philosophy departments is no more susceptible to neutral adjudication than is the disagreement between theists and atheists. To say that cultural politics has the last word on these matters is to say once again that the question, should we be talking about God, should we be speculating about zombies, should we talk about what race people belong to, are not posterior to the questions, does God exist, could some of the humanoids in this room be zombies, are there such things as distinct races within the human species? They are the same questions. For any consideration relevant to the cultural political question is equally relevant to the ontological question and vice versa. But from the point of view of philosophers like Nagel, who warn against the lures of verification and putting human beings at the center, to think them the same questions is itself a confusion. That is, the standoff extends to the metaphilosophical level. From the point of view of Nagel's philosophy, this whole Sellers, Dennett, Wittgenstein line of approach is a lack of a robust sense of reality, which makes you look for public criteria for what in fact there aren't public criteria but may exist anyway, from the other metaphilosophical side, namely mine. What they call a robust sense of reality is just what you shouldn't have, because it's bad for human society for people to have robust senses of reality. It's bad for human society not to adopt the doctrine of the ontological priority of the social. In other words, the metaphilosophical issue comes around to cultural politics again, rather than cultural politics having its issues resolved by, recent philosophical discoveries, so to speak. Okay, I'm going to skip a section or two. Brandom gets very technical on the subject of the nature of existence, and I'll skip that. And I'll read a little of it and then start skipping. The view that I've been ascribing to Brandom may make it seem as if acknowledging the ontological priority of the social entails allowing existence to be ascribed to anything society finds it convenient to talk about. And this may seem ridiculously counterintuitive. Even though society might set its face against race talk or against God talk, it can hardly set its face against talk of stars, animals, plants, pains, pleasures, truths, falsehoods, all the stuff that everybody everywhere has always talked about. There are critics of the doctrine of the ontological primacy of the social will say limits to society's existence to talk things out of existence. Brandom, James, and Sellers would agree that there are limits, but they'd insist that it's important to specify what sort of considerations set these limits. There are three sorts of them. First, transcendental limits. These are set by the need to talk about something, to have, as in philosophical jargon, intentionality, to refer to objects, things we can represent well or badly, rather than just making noises, which, though they may change behavior, lack aboutness. Second, practical limits set by the transcultural need all human beings have to distinguish between, for example, poisonous and nourishing substances, up and down, humans and non-humans, truths and falsehoods, male and female, right and left, and so on. And finally, cultural limits set by our previous social decisions, by a particular society's actually existing norms. That is, societies don't have a choice about whether to use the notion talking about, or making a true statement, or more painful than pleasurable, or something like that. I mean, you just can't imagine a society can get along without that. But there's a lot of other stuff you can't imagine societies getting along without, and that's where the cultural limits come in. Brandom argues for the existence of the first sort of limit, the transcendental limit, by claiming that no society can make much use of language unless it can wield the notion of a certain locution being about a certain object. To be an object, Brandom argues, is to be something that we can get wrong. Indeed, it is to be something that everybody might always get wrong in certain respects, though obviously not in all respects. That is, human beings could always be wrong about a certain feature of the stars, but they can't be wrong that the stars are what appear in the dark at night, that they are a long way away, that all the platitudes which you use to teach children how to use the word star. If we were wrong about all of them, we wouldn't be talking about stars, so there'd be nothing for us to be wrong about. But you can be wrong about any particular thing you can say about stars. The notion of object is thus derivative from the notion of social practice, as is that of truth about an object. That's the point of saying, as I did earlier, that truth and reality exist for the sake of social practices. We use the words truth and reality. We talk about truth and reality because our social practices are improved by doing so. In contrast, for most of the philosophers who hold to what Brandom calls representationalism, as distinguished from Brandom's own inferentialism, the concept of object is primitive and inexplicable. Representationalists think that you have to know what an object is in order to have any idea of what language or mind or rationality or knowledge is. For all of these notions must be understood in terms of accurate representations of objects. In contrast, Brandom's argument is that the true primitives are those that make possible the application of social norms, notions like having done A or said P, you cannot get away with doing B or saying Q. Shame on you, you will be punished. Things like that. In other words, what gets us off the ground is adjusting human behavior to the expectations of other humans, and truth, objectivity, object, world, reality, and so on come along as devices for facilitating this process of engaging in social cooperation. Doing things Brandom's way amounts to dropping the old skeptical question, how can the human mind manage to get accurate representations of reality, in favor of such questions as, why does the human community need the notion of accurate representation of objects? Why should the question of getting in touch with reality ever have arisen? How did we ever come to see an abyss between subject and object? How did we ever get ourselves in a position where skeptical doubts like Descartes seemed plausible? The main point I want to make in this paper, there's a long story behind what I just said in Brandom, but I'm not going to go into. But the main point I want to make in the paper as a whole is that the change Brandom is urging in what I just said parallels the change from a theistic to a humanistic worldview. In recent centuries, instead of asking whether God exists, people have started asking whether it's a good idea for us to continue talking about him, and which human purposes might be served by doing so. Asking, in short, what use the concept God might be to human beings. Brandom is suggesting that philosophers, instead of asking whether we really are in touch with objects outside the mind, objects that are as they are regardless of what we think of them, should ask what human purposes are served by thinking about objects existing outside of the mind, independent of how they are conceived of. And his book, an immensely tangled 700 pages, is an answer to that question. In the course of his book, Brandom argues that it was not only a good idea, it was a pragmatically indispensable one, for if we'd never talked about objects, we should never have had much to say. Our language would never have developed beyond an exchange of causally efficacious grunts. talk about objects independent of the mind was valuable because it helped the anthropoids become human, not because human beings awakened to their obligation to represent such objects accurately, their obligation to the truth. The analogy with humanism and theism is obvious. The humanistic account is, jolly good thing we started talking about God because it got us up from the apes, but now we can ask what purposes did it serve, and maybe that purpose has been served, and we can go on and talk about something else. The loss of the world, which idealism seemed helpless to avoid, is thus not a problem for Brandam's inferentialism, since, I quote Brandam, objectivity is a structural aspect of the socio-perspectival form of conceptual contents. The permanent distinction between how things are and how they are taken to be by some interlocutor is built into the social inferential articulation of concepts. Okay, now I'm going to skip for a while. Coming back now to the analogy between God and consciousness, there's no problem about giving either the term what it is like to be conscious or the term God, a being without parts or passions, a place in a language game. We know how the trick is done, and we have had lots of experience watching both games being played. But in neither case is there any point to raising questions about existence, because there's no neutral logical space within which discussion can proceed between people inclined to deny and people inclined to affirm the existence either of qualia or of God. Metaphysical questions like, does God exist, or is the spatio-temporal world real, are undiscussable because there is no agreed-upon social procedure for adjudicating such issues. That's why we sometimes call them merely philosophical. In Brandam's jargon, this is why existent thing is only a pseudo-sortal. It looks like the name of a kind of being, but it isn't. The very idea of a universal sortal term is incoherent, for to be a sortal is to come with a set of canonical designators in tow, that is, a set of entities by reference to which you decide whether other entities exist. If discussion of God's existence or the reality of the world of common sense were to be discussable in a way that did not boil down to cultural politics, we should somehow have to have transcended both God and the world so as to see them against some neutral background, some list of things that we know exist other than God and the world, which we could use as reference points to decide on the reality of either God or the spatio-temporal world. The fact that does God exist is a bad question suggests that a better question would be, do we want to weave one or more of the various religious traditions with their accompanying pantheons together with our deliberation over moral dilemmas, our deepest hopes, and our need to be rescued from despair? Alternatively, does one or more of these religious traditions provide language we wish to use when putting together our self-image, determining what is most important to us? If none of them do, we shall treat all such traditions and their pantheons as offering mere mythologies. Nevertheless, within each such mythology, as within the Sherlock Holmes stories, there will be truth and falsity, literal truth and falsity about existence claims. It will be literally true that there exists a child of Zeus and Semele, but false that there is a child of Uranus and Aphrodite. It will be literally true that there is a third person of the Godhead, but false that there is a 13th. Our decision about whether to treat the religious tradition in which we were brought up as offering literal truths or as telling stories for which we no longer have any use will depend on a lot of different things, whether we continue to think that prayer and worship will make a difference in what happens to us and so on. But there are no criteria for when it's rational and when irrational to switch from adhesion to a tradition to a skeptical mere myth view of it or back again. Decisions about what language games to play, what to talk about and what not to talk about, and for what purposes are not made on the basis of agreed-upon criteria. That's why they're so hard. Cultural politics is the least norm-governed human activity. It is the site of generational revolt and thus the growing point of culture, the place where traditions and norms are all up for grabs at once. Paul Tillich remarked that in a post-Enlightenment Western culture, the vision of a social democratic utopia has begun to play the role of God, of the non-criteria governed sort I've been putting under the heading cultural politics. Like most recommendations of religious belief in the West since the Enlightenment, They were arguments that we shall eventually be driven to despair without specifically religious symbols of ultimate concern, the sort that Thomas Paine and Shelley thought we could very well do without. Tillich's term, finding an adequate symbol of ultimate concern, is, however, not an improvement on old-fashioned phrases like finding meaning in life, formulating a satisfactory self-image, discovering what the good is, and so on. Indeed, it's slightly worse than these because it relies on a distinction between the symbolic and the literal that is a relic of representationalist philosophy. Tillich thought that scientific and common sense beliefs could have literal truth, but religious beliefs could have only symbolic truth. He thought this because he believed that the former could be considered accurate representations of reality, whereas the notion of accuracy was inappropriate to the latter. A Brandomian inferentialist, however, has no use for the literal symbolic distinction. The only relevant distinction she can countenance is one between logical spaces constructed for certain purposes, e.g. those of physical science, mathematics, chess, and other logical spaces constructed for other purposes, those provided by the Platonic dialogues, the Jataka, the home stories, the New Testament, and so on. Debate about the utility of these various logical spaces and about the desirability or undesirability of uniting them with or disjoining them from one another is the substance of cultural politics. From the point of view common to Brandom and Hegel, there's nothing special about natural science, or better, to the discourse constituted by the union of the logical space of everyday transcultural common sense with that of modern natural science, that would entitle that framework to the term literal truth. That is a metaphysical complement that science can do without and that serves no purpose. The term literal truth harks back to the bad Kantian idea that discourse about physical objects is the paradigm case of making truth claims and that all other areas of discourse are in danger of being non-cognitive. If we drop that idea, we shall have no use for the kind of theology of symbolic forms that began with Schleiermacher, and we will not be tempted to make room for God by talking about symbolic truth or imaginative truth or emotional truth or metaphorical truth or moral truth or anything of that sort. Just be truth, philosophy. Too cool. Dropping these notions will lead us to drop the idea that God requires to be talked about in a special way because he's such a special kind of being. For Brandom, there's no such thing as a certain kind of object demanding to be spoken of in a certain kind of language. To say that God requires to be talked about in a certain way is no more illuminating than to say that transfinite cardinal numbers or neutrinos demand to be talked about in certain ways. Since we wouldn't know what any of these entities were unless we knew that they were entities talked about in those ways, the idea that they demand this treatment is utterly unhelpful. It's as if we praised a poet's choice of metaphor for fitting our otherwise indescribable experience perfectly. Such praise rings hollow simply because we can't identify the experience without the help of the metaphor. It's as if, to paraphrase Wittgenstein, we exclaimed with delight over the fact that a plain figure fits so perfectly into its surroundings. Like Wittgenstein, Brandom thinks that anything has a sense if you give it one. More consistently than Wittgenstein, Brandom can follow up on this by saying that whatever philosophy is, it is not Pace, Kant, the Tractatus, Carnap, and so on, the detection of nonsense. The language game played by theologians with the transcendental terms or with Heideggerese, and the one played by philosophers of mind who talk about the independence of qualia from behavior and environment is as coherent as any discourse has ever been. But the coherence of talk about X does not guarantee the discussability of the existence of X. Talk about numbers is ideally coherent, but it lends no help to metaphysical discussion of, are numbers really real? Are they really out there? And similarly, pointless questions. Nor does the coherence of Christian theology help us discuss the existence of God. That's not because of an ontological fact about God, but because of sociological facts about the unavailability of norms to regulate discussion. I cut some more and cut to the very end. I've been arguing in this paper that we should substitute the question about the cultural desirability of God talk for the ontological question of the existence of God, but I've said little about what discussion of the former question looks like. As I see it, the question of whether to keep on talking about God, whether to keep that logical space open, so to speak, needs to be divided into two sub-questions. The first is a question about an individual's right to be religious, even though unable to justify her religious beliefs to others. can be formulated in the first person as, have I the right to my religious devotion even though there is no social practice that legitimizes inferences from or to the sentences that I employ in this devotional practice, a lack which makes it impossible for many, perhaps even all, of my fellow humans to make any sense of this practice. Aside from a few science-worshipping philosophers who retain Clifford's antagonism to religious belief, most intellectuals of the present day would answer this question affirmatively, just as James did. The increasing privatization of religion during the last 200 years has created a climate of opinion in which people have the same right to idiosyncratic forms of religious devotion as they do to write poems or paint pictures that nobody else perhaps can make any sense of. It's a feature of a democratic and pluralist society that our religion is our own business, something we needn't discuss with others, much less try to justify them unless we want to, unless they ask us to. Such a society tries to leave as much free space as possible for individuals to develop their own sense of who they are and what their lives are for, asking only that they obey Mill's precept and extend to others the tolerance they themselves enjoy. But such societies have, of course, been troubled by the other question, what about organized religion? What about the churches? It's possible to agree that society should grant private individuals the right to formulate private systems of belief while remaining militantly anti-clerical. James and Mill agree that there's nothing wrong with churches unless their activities do social harm, but when you try to figure out which actually existing churches do how much social harm, things get difficult. The socio-political history of the West of the last 200 years is spotted with controversies such as those over Jefferson's Statute of Religious Freedom, the laicization of education in France, the 19th century Kulturkampf in Germany, the current controversy in Turkey and France about Muslim women wearing the veil, and so on. Issues like these require different resolutions in different countries in different centuries, and I think it would be absurd to suggest that there are universally valid norms that could be invoked to settle them. But I would urge that debate over such concrete political questions, that is, can French Muslim girls wear veils to the lycée, is more useful for human happiness than debate over the existence of God. These are the questions which remain once we realize that appeals to religious experience are of no use in settling what tradition should be maintained and which replaced, and after we have come to think natural theology pointless. We shall not appeal to religious experiences in order to decide what social practices to abandon or adopt if we follow Wittgenstein, Sellers, and Brandom in thinking that there is no intermediary called what the experience was really of or what the experience was really like in between the altered state of the nervous system associated with the onset of the claimed experience and the resulting discursive commitments undertaken by a member of a certain language-using community. We shall dismiss natural theology if we see the undiscussability of God's existence not as a testimony to his superior status, but as a consequence of the attempt to give him that status, a side effect of making him so incomparably special as to be a being whose existence cannot be discussed by reference to any antecedent list of canonical designators. If we grant the Salarzian doctrine that all awareness is a linguistic affair, and the Brandomian doctrine that existent object is not a genuine sortal, we shall cut ourselves off from many of the traditional varieties of God talk. I think that inferentialist philosophy of language, that is, Brandom, helps us understand why neither appeals to experience nor appeals to reason have been of much help to us when we are choosing between alternative social practices. To move into the intellectual world, to which Brandom's inferentialism facilitates access, would be to treat questions of which language games to play as questions of how members of a democratic society may best adjust the balance between their responsibilities to themselves and their responsibilities to their fellow citizens.